Right. I guess it's live. I didn't even see it come up there. Today's reading is called Live Life as If Everything Were Sacred. Live life as if everything were sacred. To which I would say, why? Because everything is sacred. So here we go. First quote is from Pearl Bailey, who says, people see God every day. They just don't recognize him. People see God every day. They don't recognize God. And Ernest Holmes, this is a good quote, and it's kind of helps us to think about values and what's going on. An hour a day spent in silent meditation will not save us from the confusion of life. The 51% of a person's thinking is what counts. And to my mind, what Ernest Holmes is saying here is you can meditate. You can meditate for half an hour. You can meditate for an hour. You can even meditate for 3 hours. But if the majority of your thinking is in a negative direction, then it really doesn't matter. In addition, meditation's good, and Holmes was one of the ones who promoted meditation. But what he's saying is that the object of the exercise ultimately is to make sure that the majority of our thinking is in a positive, life-affirming direction. And that's what he's saying here. And this is from Rev Ron Fox. And I do have some comments here. Positive comments, by the way. I'm not disagreeing with Ron Fox at all. I believe the purpose of worship is to remind us that we are one with God. It's a means by which we can find our center. God doesn't need or demand our prayer. Prayer helps us to find ourselves. He says, many of us were brought up thinking worship meant following a set of rules. We showed God love by making sacrifices like fasting, going to church, foregoing certain foods, etc., etc. Oftentimes, the rules became an end in themselves. In the Bible, the Pharisees rebuked Jesus for healing on the Sabbath. Remember that in the Jewish mind, or at least some parts of the Jewish mind then and today, the Sabbath is completely holy and you should do the absolute minimum. Obviously you can breathe, you can eat, but not much more than that. But what Jesus says to the Pharisees, he reminds them that the Sabbath exists for us. I think he actually said, depending on the translation you read, he says, the Sabbath was meant for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was meant for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, the seventh day of rest was intended to help us to just recover our energies. And it wasn't intended to be something where you strictly enforce religious rules. It's a tool, an instrument to bring us closer to God. Simple as that. When we live as if everything were sacred, we are worshiping. How we live every day is a means of worship. When we take time to spread love, compassion, joy, and peace, when we appreciate the gift of life, when we see God in everything, then our life becomes a constant prayer. Worshipping is a matter of the heart and not the rule book. When we open our hearts to the beauty and goodness that surrounds us, we can't help but become, to paraphrase St. Francis of Assisi, that is, an instrument of God's peace. I think St. Francis said, make me an instrument of thy peace. That's where he was coming from. And as an aside, when my wife and I visited Assisi and went to the church there in the area where Francis spent most of his life, I am not kidding you, you could feel a sense of the divine, a sense of the holy. It was different. I mean, you at least I could. I said you could. And my wife agrees with me. There was something intangible that you couldn't put your finger on, but the place was different. I mean, it was holy. I mean, there was no, to whatever holy means to you, it was different. It was a place set apart. But you could really feel it. I mean, it was amazing. You could really feel it. But getting back to what Reverend Ron's promoting here, I actually remember reading, and then I looked it up actually, that Thomas Troward was one of the early thinkers in New Thought, not right at the beginning, such as Phineas Parker's Quimby, the clockmaker, who kind of started the ball rolling in the mid-19th century, and then Mary Baker Eddy, and then others who followed on from them. He was, and I think he joined New Thought somewhere in around the turn of the century. That's the going from the 19th to the 20th century. You know, he had his problems. He had his issues. You know, definitely if you read one of the last chapters, and I'm not sure if I think it's the Edinburgh Lectures. Anyway, you can see, you know, he was a racist. He believed that the Anglo-Saxon race was superior to all the rest, and then he had this wacky idea that he believed that ultimately all races would come into being of the Anglo-Saxon race or something like that. So obviously that's not something to which we ascribe. I mean, it isn't. It's racist. But I mean, lots and lots of really famous figures in history who promoted a lot of good stuff have got the side of them that isn't brilliant. And that's how I look at it. You know, some people have cast Troward out because he was a racist. I don't, because I tell people when I quote him, hey, he was a racist. However, if you look at these ideas that he had, they're good and they're consistent with what Ernest Holmes taught. Why? Because Ernest Holmes used a lot of Thomas Troward's ideas in his teachings. But as I said, you can look at people like Gandhi and lots of people who were famous, great figures in history who had a side to them that wasn't something that you would want to emulate. So I don't believe in casting Troward out into the wilderness. I think you are honest about him. You say he had this bad side, but you also go along with what was good that he taught, or at least what I think is good, you know. And he actually used a different word for worship. He called it worthship. You know, so what he was intending to say by worthship was that you didn't sort of bow down in adoration before a being that was outside of yourself and say how great it was and how unworthy you were in its presence. He rather looked back to the original Anglo-Saxon meaning of worship, which was actually worthship, or the Anglo-Saxon equivalent of that. And what he was saying was that you acknowledge the infinite and the all-powerfulness of the infinite, but also how you yourself are an expression of that one source that is in and through and has everything. So that one source is flowing through you, that it is greater and beyond comprehension, but it's a power that you have got flowing through you, and you acknowledge and you honor that power that's flowing through you. And that's why we can never claim that we do this ourselves. Jesus said, of myself, I can do nothing. You know, it's the divine that does it through me. And that's the same thing. So I think it's a good way of looking at it. Worship versus worship, because the word worship, tracing back to its original roots, actually is worthship. So there you are. That's my story today, and I am sticking to it. So the affirmations that we get, plural, are: today I set the intention to live my life as a prayer. Today I set my intention to live my life as a prayer. To me, that means that I set my intention to live my life in accordance with the highest principles of life. I see God all around me and give thanks for the gift of life and for the beauty that manifests everywhere I look. So in other words, you look outside, you see a tree, that's an expression of God. You see a planet, it's an expression of God. You see a human being, that's an expression of God. And depending on your definition of God, the all, everything, that which is. So, and the final one, which is an easy one, I am blessed. And this is one that we often overlook. I'm blessed simply because I enjoy the gift of life. I'm blessed because I enjoy the gift of life. And I am truly grateful for this gift of life. And I claim that gift of life as a wonderful expression of the divine. And I claim that every single person is expressing that in a fruitful and a wonderful way. And I'll release this word into the divine law, because the divine law always says yes. And so it is. My colleague, Reverend Lisa, will be on tomorrow at about 9:15 on Creative Life Spiritual Center's Facebook page. I think that's the one she broadcast to. It goes on later on her YouTube channel. And also tomorrow, somewhere around about noon or later if her work gets in the way, we have our midweek meditation. And practitioner Daniel Mercadal will come with a midweek meditation. So if you've ever wondered what it's like to do a meditation somewhere around about the noon hour or during the day, tune in to Creative Life Spiritual Center's Facebook page. And I'll be back tomorrow at 5 p.m. Wherever you tune into this, whatever channel it is you tune into this on, I'll be back tomorrow on that channel. So until next time, namaste.